Hello and welcome to another programme from Parent Pay Group and the Education Futures Festival. One of the people that we had at the live event on the 18th of May that I've spoken about several times was Ruth McKay. I'm always pleased to have Ruth as part of anything. She's had a tremendous career. She's now the head teacher in Kirkwall Grammar School in Orkney, having been head teacher at Portobello, having been a head teacher in Scottish Borders, and occupied various other roles, including a national role on what was called the National Priorities Programme back in the day, which I always regard as a breakthrough move, which took her from the murky world of singles to full-blown albums and general success. And Ruth is someone who I know cares deeply about young people and cares deeply about education. And she's a woman who's no stranger to a strong view. So, Ruth, for those people who weren't fortunate enough to be at the Botanics in the 18th, tell us about the main things that you were saying about the future for Scottish children and what we're doing about it.
Thank you, David, for that introduction. Looking back now on a career as a head teacher that's lasted for about 15 years, I think that the main reflection that I have in terms of what has changed has been the scale and scope of change that we're faced with. And in many respects, that's a very positive picture. I think there's a real appetite for reform in education in Scotland at various different levels, particularly in the secondary sector around about qualifications. But I think some of the other changes have been less welcome. We are obviously never in these kind of discussions when we're not mentioning the impact of the COVID pandemic and the fact that that has acted really as a catalyst for many of the other trends and developments that we were already seeing before COVID. It's accelerated the concerns around about young people's mental health and well-being, for example. It's accelerated the impact of screens and social media. So I think we're at a really interesting juncture in Scottish education. There is an appetite for reform, but we're not yet necessarily in a position where we've got a consensus around what that reform should look like. And in terms of what that means for our young people, I think it means that there is an urgency for us to, quickly assess the situation and make decisions about how we're going to progress things so that we're able to mitigate the impact of all of these different circumstances on them. Because the one thing that hasn't changed over the course of my career is the great joy that comes from working closely with young people, seeing their potential. Whenever I'm feeling a bit fed up with some of the challenges that face us at various different levels on a day-to-day basis, I go for a wee walk around the school and I chat to some young people, and they soon cheer me up. So I think we're definitely in a position where we owe it to them to coalesce around the priorities and make decisions about how we're going to be moving forward. And I think key to that is going to be making progress in a way which doesn't box us in, but, moving forward into a future that can be as flexible as possible.
I think that's a really interesting summary in lots of ways. I think your references to the impact of COVID are particularly timely because no one foresaw it. Possibly we should. Somebody made a film about it only a few years before, and we all managed to ignore that. But that came along almost as a surprise and, either changed or intensified everything. So that message you're giving about flexibility and not boxing in, I think is a message that people need to hear. But what does that look like on the ground? What does that mean going forward, Ruth?
Well, I'm not sure that my crystal ball is functioning any better than anyone else's. I think one of the things certainly is for me is around about thinking about some of the structures that we have, some of the things that would be, the great immovables of the past. This week schools across Scotland will have begun their new timetables. David, you'll know as well as I do that the timetable was always cited as one of the great monoliths that wouldn't allow various things to happen. There are others in our kind of education environment. The structure of the school year, for example. the way in which the school week is structured. We also have a workforce now who are expecting different things from the way in which, expecting different careers and the way in which they work. We've got much larger proportion of people joining the profession looking for flexibility, not looking to work full time in many circumstances, looking for rewards from a career in education, which are perhaps different than people would have been looking for in the past. I think there's much less interest in climbing a career ladder or seeking promotion. I think there's much more interest for educators in many respects now in terms of having balance, having fulfilment in their role. And I think that changes, some of what we need to do in terms of how schools are organised. But I think alongside that is the impact that, the way that schools are organised is having on young people. So I had a conversation earlier on today, for example, with a young person whose well-being is a little bit wobbly just now, and she was able to articulate that something that is a challenge for her is not being at school for so long over the summer, because she feels really supported at school, and she, that lack of structure for such a long period of time, she has got the wherewithal to identify could be a challenge. She's not alone, and I think that there's quite a number of staff that, while holidays are enjoyed, are beginning to question whether we're organising things in the right way. I'm going to stop there, because if I suggest too much about holidays, then I'll never get invited to anything ever again.
But I think one of the things that you're getting at with all of these comments is that, in a sense, that the future is here now, that there are lots of things already that are very different from the principles and circumstances that we organise schools around. And it ties back into one of the things that you said earlier on about urgency, that while we need reflection and while we need to think further and deeply about the future, we really need to be taking action now, because things not only will change, things have changed. And I mean, I think what you're suggesting is that we haven't really caught up with the impact of these changes.
I think that's right. And I think, I wouldn't want to suggest that everything is down to COVID or down to, to other circumstances. I think some of these discussions have been ongoing for quite a long time, and were to a degree derailed a bit by, the interruption that everybody experienced in the pandemic. I think flexibility in learning in terms of course provision, being able to think about learning perhaps in smaller building blocks rather than in, chunks of a year at a time, which demand that you attend at certain times and in certain ways. I think getting back to that, focus on skills, thinking about, how do we offer blended programs which allow young people to take account of their own experience in a more holistic way. We are very clear in Scotland that our curriculum is the totality of experience that a young people has. But in many respects, we're still really only counting the bits that happen during the school day that are assessed by external bodies. And I think we need to start putting our money where our mouth is in terms of some of the changes that have been spoken about those things. That means, obviously it means curriculum reform. We know we've got the curriculum improvement cycle underway. Everybody's currently waiting with bated breath to see the draft framework that's going to be shared over the course of the next few months. But I've also been, at events recently where some of the people closest to that work have been saying there's a health warning around about these documents because they could change again when the profession see them. And again, there's a tension in that, because it's really welcome that the curriculum improvement cycle is working in a way which is taking that feedback from grassroots teachers. That's something which everybody is, in classrooms is always concerned about having a voice in these matters. But there are risks inherent in that as well, because there's a capacity issue for many people. And there's also a kind of a sense of everything being a little bit suspended until the documents and the framework has been firmed up a bit. There's a lot of talk about, we need to make time for development, but we don't have anything to develop just yet. There's a kind of a tension inherent in a lot of these situations at the moment that I think is going to have to be carefully managed at every level.
Are you approaching this in a spirit of optimism, Ruth, or is it more a spirit of caution?
Well, you know me, David. I'm not averse to taking a bit of a risk, but I think we have to be taking measured risks, because what we're talking about here is young folks' future. It's their qualifications and their learning, and we know that it's really important that we get that right. I think certainly there is a lot of focus around about ensuring that reforms are rolled out in a way that allows them to be properly implemented. I think we need to learn from the lessons of Curriculum for Excellence. And I think there's still a need to be more specific around about the kind of nuts and bolts that we expect, regardless of where in Scotland you go to school, and the account that can be taken of local context. Because I think that balance has never really been there in CFE, and I think it has led to a widening of some of the gaps that we know we're always trying to combat in education. I think in terms of the circumstances that teachers find themselves teaching in across Scotland, there are gaps in opportunity for them in terms of professional learning, in terms of the ability to network. If you're in an isolated or rural community, you don't necessarily have access to some of the networks that you do if you're in a more urban or central belt environment. And I think, while it's right and proper that we focus on the outcomes and the impact for young people, we've also got to think really carefully about how we're supporting the teaching profession across Scotland, as well as being mindful of, the other, groups and agencies that support the teachers, because we know that, education is not only delivered by people working in schools. There's all of these partnerships that we should have access to, the quality of what we're able to do with local FE colleges, for example, the quality of employer engagement. And I think these things will become more and more relevant. But, as the people who are the early adopters begin to take up these opportunities and accelerate, we've got to make sure that those that are not able or not in the same circumstances with the same opportunities aren't left behind. So I think there's a big job to be done around about coordinating that across Scotland, but also across smaller areas within Scotland.
I got a real sense on the day from yourself and also from Stuart Clark, who we've also interviewed as part of this series, of real dynamism and commitment amongst head teachers. So I know that won't be universal, but I got a real feeling from the two of you that at the level of school leadership, there's a real willingness to move forward. And in a sense, you're looking for a combination of permission, structure and support. Is that a reasonable summary? I mean, I know you're involved at national level with the head teachers' organisations.
Yeah. hmm I think so, absolutely. And um, again, if I go back to some of the discussions that were around before the pandemic, um, there's been a lot of discussion about empowerment of head teachers. There's been a lot of discussion about empowering the people that are closest to young people to make the decisions that are right for the young people that they are supporting in their context. And I am not somebody who would want to moved to the kind of model that you see sometimes south of the border where you're responsible for everything. And if your roof leaks, then you're finding the money for that as well. I think, having worked in a local authority as well as at national level, I'm really clear about the benefits of having a structure of some sort that is taking care of things like HR and finance and all of these things that otherwise can clog up the work of schools. But we need to make sure that those structures are not inhibiting opportunities for creativity in individual schools through head teachers and other empowered leaders. And I think there's actually tremendous untapped potential amongst Scotland's head teachers. We've seen some of the big national organisations come through a time where they found it tricky to have leadership in place, and hopefully we're on the way out of that situation. But I think there's definitely scope to involve head teachers and other staff in schools much more in finding solutions. And we've spoken a lot about COVID. One of the big lessons coming out of COVID for myself and others was, goodness me, schools were absolutely at the heart of, keeping young people well, supporting families, supporting communities through that really difficult time. And I think, there's lots to be learned from that, because there was when everybody was up against it, and so much of what we were used to was not available to us, I think there were lots of creative opportunities, and creative solutions found. And in some respects, I think there's been a little bit of a step back from that, now that we're past the stage of hand sanitizer and face masks. Some of that, I'm sure, is just about, well, we're back to normal now. But I think there's a need for us to kind of pause and think, well, was normal really working for us, or have these circumstances maybe shown us that there are other ways of organising things?
Yeah, kind of brutal form of stress testing the system, I think. But I mean, a lot of what you've just said, I think, is interesting in the context of parent pay group, for example, who are trying to look at ways of providing a bit of structure for schools. But the other thing I wanted to just move on to before we finish off is, you've had a really outstanding commitment to the aspect of relationships in schools. We were, I was involved with you when we had the Portobello Learning Festival, and that had that whole idea of addressing adverse childhood experience, disadvantage of young people at its heart. What more do we need to do around the relationships aspect?
I think increasingly, relationships are always at the heart of things. I think increasingly, as resources become more scarce, as the level of need increases, and the type of need has shifted slightly, I think I've become aware that while relationships will always be central, they're not the only solution. They're not everything. You can't fix everything with good relationships. You also need resource, and you need to have, for many schools, including my own at the moment, that's about actually having a staff resource, being able to get people with the right qualifications to deliver learn. Huge activity and focus around additional support needs just now, rightly so, because I think some of the republications that have come out have really highlighted that we've got a very aspirational set of policies around additional support needs in Scotland. I don't know anybody who is not full square behind that in terms of the aspiration that's set out. But at the moment, we don't have the resource in various different ways to be able to achieve that aspiration in a manner that's equitable for young people and families and staff. So there's a kind of urgency around about that.
I mean, I think you made a major commitment, as I said, to the whole idea of developing better relationships.
Yeah.
And I think what you're saying is consistent with what you started off with, that the idea that relationships are important, but so is context, so is resource, that what we need is we need a strategy that addresses all elements of school life, if you like.
So what I would say is that while relationships will always be central, they are not a panacea, and schools also require appropriate levels of resource and support in other areas. And one of those, which is particularly relevant in the context of the purpose of this discussion, is around about the kind of administrative and management information support, because being able to handle data, complex data sets which have got many and complex relationships with other data sets in a way that is agile and flexible is absolutely critical as we move forward. The level of frustration that is felt by staff working in schools with systems around MIS that are just no longer fit for purpose is really significant. And from the point of view of the things that make schools tick, when teachers and administrators and leaders are spending time fighting with MIS that's not producing the goods for them, that's time that could be spent with young people, that could be devoted to learning, that could be moving forward other creative and exciting opportunities. So I think that's one of the the things that is a most obvious need for us at the moment is to get operational systems that run smoothly, that interact well with each other, that can cope with having something external plugged in, to reflect the kind of diverse nature of what schools are doing around about the country. And um, the more all singing, all dancing, the better in terms of being able to deliver timetabling reports or, interact with systems that can do that for us. Because ultimately, this is about getting back to what we spoke about, what was at the heart of Macron, was about creating time for teaching.
Yeah.
It was about, making sure that the profession could focus on the things that were going to make the biggest difference. That occurs when we have systems around us that work well and do their job smoothly and can be adapted to work in an agile way to support the developments that we know are going to be coming towards us in the not too distant future, we hope.
I think you've also hit on another big theme of the day, that we need to get to a stage where things happen more often because of the system rather than despite it. And I think that clarion cry, if you like, to let's get the problems out the way, let's get the unnecessary blocks and hurdles out of the way that will allow us to find that flexibility. And I think the other thing you've done superbly is to get at that idea of we need a balance between structure and innovation. We need the balance between the thinking holistically about the school and focusing on the individual needs of young people, and also about the investment that we need to make that possible. And I think that chart's a really sensible way forward, and it's been really helpful. Is there anything that you wanted to say, Ruth, that you haven't had the chance to?
I don't think so. As ever, a conversation with you, David, will have me thinking for the next 2 or 3 days about different aspects of it. So thank you for the opportunity to exercise my brain at this time.
Well, and I think anyone listening to this should know that we are doing this after 5 o'clock on a Friday, which is above and beyond the call of duty. So thank you so much for that, Ruth. Thank you.